time for a brief biography of James Joyce. James Augustine Aloysius Joyce was born on the 2nd of February 1882 to John and Mary, or May, Joyce, née Murray. John was a gifted man in many disciplines, but unfortunately he was also a drinker, and over the space of Joyce's 20 years living with the family, they changed residences some 12 times, as John drank his way through his inheritance, his job, his family, and his talents. By the end, James was one of the few members of the family who could still tolerate him, both sharing a love and an ability in music. Surprisingly, John Joyce managed to live to 1931, dying at the age of 82. Joyce's mother, May, died in 1903 at the age of 44. The eldest of 10, Joyce was brought up to be a good Catholic in that house, attending school in Clongowes Wood and then Belvedere College, both Jesuit-run schools. Joyce was Jesuitical in his approach for the rest of his life, as well as maintaining an abiding love for the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas. He toyed with the idea of becoming a priest himself, but had dispensed with the idea by the time he got to college. Joyce was also quite nationalistic in his early years, siding with his father over the matter of Parnell. On Parnell's death, at the age of 9, he wrote a poem about the death called Et tu, Healy, that his father had published privately. The death of Parnell haunts most of his prose works to some degree or another. At 16, he headed to University College Dublin, then in Stephen's Green. While there, at the age of 18, he published his first work, a review of Henrik Ibsen's last work, När vi döda Wagner, or, as you would put it, When We Dead Awaken. He learned to read Norwegian in order to better appreciate it, and his review of it was published in the very prestigious Fortnightly Review. This play was seen as one of Ibsen's most difficult, and at the time was perceived as somewhat unfathomable by many. Joyce graduated in 1902, and then he moved to Paris, against his mother's wishes, to study medicine. That was a bridge too far for him, and he pretty quickly quit, but stayed on in Paris to absorb the city and to read heavily at the library. He was sent for by his father when his mother was dying, and he stayed in Dublin for just over a year after she died. He started drinking himself heavily at that time. He departed from Ireland with Nora Barnacle, a woman who he had met for the first time later in 1904. Indeed, one of their first dates, on June 16, 1904, was the date that he has chosen to commemorate forever in Ulysses. From Dublin he moved to Europe as an English teacher with Berlitz. He started in Zurich before moving on to Trieste, then in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is now in Italy. He arrived in Trieste to discover there was no job for him there, but he eventually found a job elsewhere in the empire with the company in Pola, which we now know as Pula in Croatia. After 6 months there, he was back in Trieste, which was largely his base until 1915, when Italy joined the war, and then he moved back to Zurich. He did make a trip back to Dublin in 1909 to try and get Dubliners published, and he ended up also setting up Ireland's first ever cinema, which did quite well until Joyce left for Trieste again. He returned again briefly in 1912, again to try and get Dubliners published, but once again to no avail. The nearest he ever got to Dublin after this was on his visits to London. After the war, Joyce moved to Paris with a view to finish writing Ulysses, and was delighted to discover there that the publication of Dubliners and the Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man had earned him a reputation as an avant-garde writer. He was to spend most of the rest of his life there. As he grew older, his eyesight worsened to the point of him needing to wear an eye patch and undergoing several surgeries, and eventually he ended up with a court of amanuenses who were there to assist with his work. Among those amanuenses was a youngish Samuel Beckett. Various versions of the story exist, but Joyce's daughter Lucia is said to have fallen in love with him. Regardless, Beckett's true focus was on his professional relationship with her father. Joyce was to leave Paris in 1940 to escape the Nazis, and he managed to help up to 16 Jewish people escape through his connections. He had been helped in one of his worst drunken stupors back in 1904 by a Dublin man named Alfred Hunter, who was believed to be Jewish and supposed to have had an unfaithful wife. He also had a great friendship with a former student of his in Trieste, Italo Svevo, who was a Catholic of Jewish heritage, and he got much of his understanding of Judaism from asking him questions while writing Ulysses. Joyce fell into a coma on January 11th, 1941, after surgery for a perforated duodenal ulcer. He only recovered consciousness for a short period on the morning of January 13th. According to some sources, his last words were, "Does nobody understand?" Nora, by now his wife, though they lived together for 27 years before he popped the question, presumably, she was offered a full Catholic service by a priest for Joyce's funeral, but her response was, "I couldn't do that to him." Ultimately, this is just a list of the things that happened to Joyce, or that Joyce made happen. By no means is this an insight into who he is. For that, I would recommend either Richard Ellman's amazing biography of him, or just read his books. Or if you're feeling saucy, read his letters to Nora.
Those lovely seaside girls, all dimples, spires and curls, your head it simply whirls. They look all right.